Okay, hi everyone. Chatty crowd today. Hello, hello. Okay, great. So today it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Patrick Keyes, who is an assistant professor at the Department of Atmospheric Science at Colorado State University. His research is focused on a broad range of global challenges, including climate change impacts, cross-scale risks, and social ecological teleconnections. He has developed modeling tools for examining terrestrial moisture recycling, aimed at leveraging geophysical insights for research management and how humans interact with the atmospheric water cycle. He also works to understand how future methods can be used to qualitatively and quantitatively discern a sustainable path forward for society, and regularly engages with civil society, such as delivering the keynote lecture for the 2019 session of the United Nations General Assembly Second Committee. Prior to joining the Department of Atmospheric Science, Pat served as the lead scientist at CSU's School of Global Environmental Sustainability, also known as SOGIS. Previously, Pat founded an environmental consultancy that worked with local and international partners broadly on the subject of climate adaptation and resilience. Pat has a PhD in sustainability science from Stockholm University, an MS in civil and environmental engineering from the University of Washington, and a BA in biology from Willamette, of course, University. And in the fall, he will be joining Boston University as an assistant professor in the Department of Earth and Environment. Just a reminder that Pat is hosting a workshop from 1 to 2:30 on imagining a radical future in the director's conference room. We'd love to have you there. Please bring a pencil or pen or a writing utensil of some variety. And then we will also be going to lunch after the seminar. If you'd like to join us, please meet us at the front of the main seminar room. Otherwise, you can find us in the cafeteria. And then lastly, before I hand it off to Pat, we will ask questions after the seminar. The ceiling mics will be on, and then if anyone is online, we'll be taking Slido questions. So I think that's all, and we're good to go. Okay.
Okay, thank you, Kirsten. And thanks for having me here today. I asked Kirsten what kind of talk I should give because I can talk about a couple different things. And she said I should give this kind of talk because it would be, I think, maybe a little bit different, maybe whatever you're doing for the rest of the day, it's maybe a little bit of a break. And so this is gonna be probably the work that I don't wanna say I enjoy doing it the most, but it's certainly the most fun in the sense that it gets me to be creative in a way that I don't get to do in some of my other work. So with that preface, in case you fall asleep, we haven't had lunch yet, but it's possible you might fall asleep. The Anthropocene challenges our ability to comprehend the present, let alone the future. We need methods to help us make sense of potential 21st century turbulence. And futures methods, what I will talk about today, systematically expand the scope of the scenarios that we consider, and it can enhance our anticipatory capacity for surprises. So now you can fall asleep, perfect. So the Anthropocene. So this is an idea that's been kicked around for decades at this point, and it captures the time that we're in now, this sort of period of intense anthropogenically driven change on the planet. I suspect many, if not most of you, have come across this term already. And I like this photo because I feel like it really captures the Anthropocene very effectively in different ways. So this is taken from one of the tallest, well, it was, I think, the tallest tower building in Shenzhen, China, in southern China. It's probably not the tallest building there anymore. And in the foreground, we can see the sort of intense industrial development, industrial parks, dense residential units, et cetera. Across this semi-engineered waterway, we see this kind of similarly dense but different purpose landscape of agricultural production. You can see some mountains and some deforestation in the background, and then if you kind of squint, you can see up there another kind of mega city in the background. And so this, to me, really captures, in my mind, what the Anthropocene is, this intense transformation of the land surface and then correspondingly intense transformations of the climate and the Earth system around it. And there are lots of different ways that we can think about this. So here are a couple figures from a paper by Will Steffen several years ago and other authors. And we can think about the Anthropocene as this time where humanity is affecting the planet, but it's not uniformly affecting the planet. Different parts of society are affecting the planet more than others. Climate change might push the planet toward temperatures we haven't seen for millions of years in the longer term, especially 100 or 200 years from now, especially if we don't get our act together from an emissions perspective. And this is potentially outside humanity's evolutionary experience. So the conditions that we could be headed toward are very different than what we've seen in the past. Again, I don't need to probably convince anybody in this room of that. I've tried to grapple with this a little bit in different ways. One of them is this piece of work that was published several years ago on Anthropocene risk, trying to cast and interpret the kind of the topic of risk management through the idea of the Anthropocene, this intense anthropogenic change. Others have sort of, and I've continued that work in recent years with some colleagues up at CSU, trying to take a little bit of a critical perspective about how we're even thinking about the future and how the process of creating and constructing scenarios can actually feed back on the possibilities that we even conceive of as legitimate. So another way we could think about the present day is like something like this. This is not an actual sign as far as I'm aware of, but this is a way that you can sort of think of we're potentially close to some sort of big change, and we're not totally sure where that edge is. And so another way that I sometimes try and communicate this is the sense of unprecedented change. So this is a figure from the latest IPCC report from 2022. This is from Working Group 3. And so, we could talk about the different ways that this version of the IPCC decided to classify warming, but we can also think about the SSPs, sort of roughly what they correspond to in terms of end-of-century temperature change. And then even more kind of trying to distill this down, we can think about, well, this is the trajectory we're sort of on now, maybe middle around maybe the SSP 245. And then when I'm trying to communicate this to a non-scientific audience, often what I'll say is this is a world where every year will be the hottest year in living memory on average, okay? So of course on average. But over time, this is a way to kind of get, again, a non-scientific community to understand this is what I mean when I say unprecedented change. We have to try and wrap our heads around that sort of transformation of our world. And so some people have thought about this in the sense of a discontinuity in human society in terms of how we conceive of what's happened in the past, maybe the past century or so, and where we might be headed. A break, a disjuncture between the past and the present. And we might already be in the midst of this. It's hard to tell. When you're in the middle of a transformation, maybe it's hard to tell when it started or where it's going to end. Take a different spin on this. This is William Gibson. Does anybody know who William Gibson is? Okay. So he's a pretty well-known science and speculative fiction author. If you've ever heard of cyberpunk, he was one of the kind of progenitors of that idea in the early 80s. He wrote the book Neuromancer, among others. And in his latest trilogy of speculative fiction books, he has this concept called the jackpot, which is similar to what I just mentioned about this discontinuity, this time that we could be in right now. And this is a quote from an interview. The jackpot is the mundane cataclysm of modernity itself. It's hundreds of millions of people driving to the supermarket in their SUVs, flying 6 times a year and eating medicated animals for dinner. If the jackpot is going to happen, Gibson says it's already happening. It's been happening for at least 100 years. I mean, if you've read his books, this tracks. He's got kind of a, I won't say a grim perspective, but maybe a blunt, realistic perspective. And so it could be that we're actually here. We thought we were walking towards the edge, but maybe we're actually here, or maybe we're even here. We just don't know. Again, not real signs. But this is, we don't know where we are. So how do we make sense of this time? How will society orient, anticipate, and navigate this future turbulence? And so I want to say something about the future right now. I know many of you, maybe if not all of you, are engaged in thinking about the future through a particular lens. So I want to share a little bit about the lens that I'm going to be talking about today. So I'm going to start with a couple quotes. This is Gerard O'Neill. He was a NASA scientist, among other things, also an author. In 1981, if you ever come to my house, I'm going to probably try and get you to read this book. In 1981, he wrote a book called 2081. So at the time, in the early 80s, in 1981, Scenario science was still pretty new, systematically trying to come up with ways to discern what could happen in the future. And so he wrote this book trying to capture how people were doing this at the time. See, he's got this quote: "Most prophets, people that are doing scenario work, overestimated how much the world would be transformed by social and political change and underestimated the forces of technological change." Essentially saying it's a little bit easy to maybe imagine a dystopia or a utopia, but it's hard to get this right, something like a cell phone. This is Malka Older. She's a scholar of humanitarian studies, also a speculative fiction author, and she has this to say about imagination. If you look back 60 or 70 years from now and think of people who might have been trying to imagine the world we're in today, it is unimaginable. Even the people who are most connected to technology would not have pictured this world and what the internet has done to change it. Even so, if you go back and you read the speculative and science fiction from this time, very few authors had anything resembling the internet. Some did, but very few had kind of this modern conception of how we live our lives now. So because I'm going to use some words that you might have specific understanding of, I'm just going to establish the jargon that I'm going to use for today a little bit in talking about the future. This is adapted from Joseph Voros and actually others before him. So this is, if we think about right now and all the potential stuff that could happen moving forward, we're going to use linear time. If you've got a different flavor of time you like, we can talk about that later, but we're going to use linear time right now. We can think about first as a basic extrapolation, something like perpetual now, business as usual, boring, easy, definitely wrong, but easy. So if we're also trying, another way we can understand the future is something that we might call probable, something you might use current trends to describe, maybe like 25th and 75th percentile, something that you would have confidence about, but still based on current data. Maybe we relax the constraints a bit more now, and so we want to think of things that are plausible, things that are maybe based on current knowledge still, but we would maybe say could happen. So maybe 5th and 95th percentile now. We relax the kind of constraint about how we're going to describe the future. What's outside that? Now we've got possible. So we might not even have the data to describe this future, but maybe we have theoretical ideas about what that future could be. So we might use possible to describe this. What's outside that? We have preposterous, things that are, quote, impossible or, quote, won't ever happen. I like to show an image of ice-free Antarctica here because we would look at that maybe as geoscientists and say, well, yeah, that's pretty preposterous to show ice-free Antarctica. But in fact, it's happened before. So it's not impossible. It's just very preposterous right now. But all of these different words describe some sense of likelihood. They don't say anything about how much we want that thing to happen. So another way that we can think about the future is preferability, whether you want it to happen, whether you don't want it to happen, some sort of normative dimension. So I'm going to use some of these words today, and so I just wanted to have kind of like a common touchstone. And this is where this notion of radical future. So if you didn't know, this is going to be a weird talk. So we're going to talk about radical futures. What is that? It's a vision of the future that pushes the boundaries of social, environmental, and technological limits, possibly exceeding them. This is Jim Dator, the professor emeritus of the Hawaii Research Center for Future Studies. And he's in the futures world, he's kind of famous for having these relatively blunt kind of laws. They're called Dator's laws for futures research. The first one is the future cannot be predicted because the future does not exist. I'm sure I've had lots of people bristle at this first law. I like this from a philosophical perspective because it reminds me that unless we're convinced of fate, that the future does not exist yet. And so a lot of things that we take as granted, especially social, political, economic things, as they're certain, it's not written. And so there's an opportunity to kind of expand the scope of what we conceive of as possible. The second one is the only useful ideas about the future should at first appear to be ridiculous. This is so fun to be giving this talk at NCAR right now. Okay, we're going to come back to that. So why do we need radical futures? The future is going to be a strange place. So compared to today, especially anything after 2070, it's going to get weird. All sorts of different kinds of changes might render this world that we're headed toward unrecognizable to our parents, let alone our grandparents. I think this world is probably unrecognizable to my grandparents right now, just in the present day. Okay, so let's illustrate this. What are we looking at right now? If you know the answers to this, you don't shout them out too early. What are we looking at? Like if you've already seen this talk. A Sears catalog, totally, nailed it. But what is it? So this is an ad in the Sears catalog. What is it an ad for?
This is a guess. Is this like predicting the future 100 years ago?
No, this is actually, 40 years ago, this is an ad, like a real ad. So what is it an ad for? Exercise bikes, right? Like, well, it could be for the clothes too. I don't think so. Maybe it's like this little rowing machine thing down here in the bottom. But you can look at this, and now that we're talking about it, you're like, oh yeah, okay, yeah, this is like a pre-Peloton kind of exercise bike ad. Did you raise your hand? Sorry.
Oh no.
Okay. Okay, so you can look at this, you can interpret it, you understand what we're looking at. Ellipticals are hamster wheels for humans. Fitness is fun on Quest 2, Oculus from Facebook. What are we looking at here? What is it?
Virtual reality.
What's virtual reality?
Like computer-generated reality, where you...
Computer-generated reality. So, okay, what is that? Like, what is this thing?
It's a visualization, and it also tracks your position in space.
Whoa, how does it do that? So, do I like sit on this thing, and then it like, these things sense where I am?
You get two hand things, you put a visual mask on, that's it.
Thank you for being willing to answer my ludicrous questions. I know what virtual reality is, and I know that you're supposed to wear this hat, on your mask, and then hold these. What are they called? Controllers. Okay. You stick your arms through it, right? No. Okay. No, I'm kidding. So my point, though, is that the future, like you all know what this is, right? You all know what this is now that we're talking about it. It's a virtual reality headset. You have some sense of what this is for. But also, like this advertising copy, you get it. Like, this is snarky, right? Like, it's making fun of the notion of exercise, but you understand that because of the cultural cues that you're tuned into, right? These people would have no idea how to parse this advertisement. They probably wouldn't even get the ad because it's not clear that ellipticals existed at this time in the way that we understand them now, let alone the fact that there's no spatial, there's no sense of scale associated with the virtual reality headset. They would have no sense of what this is actually an ad for. The future is going to be weirder to us than this is to them. The pace, the rate of technological change that we're observing now is moving much more quickly than it was at this time for them. So we have to kind of wrap our heads, when we're trying to do something, thinking about the future, especially from a social dimension at all, we sort of have to push the limits if we really want to say, especially if it's 25, 30, 50 years out. Okay, so in other words, we got this futures cone, and we have lots of tools, many of which people here would be familiar with in terms of statistical-based models, physically driven models, process-based models, et cetera, to think about projections, if not predictions, of the future. And so we've got a lot of tools that we can bring to bear to understand this part of the futures cone. We have far fewer tools to understand this part, the preposterous stuff, the preferable stuff. So how do we make sense of that? And that's what brings me to, and I can say, who else is thinking deeply about the future? You all, on a daily basis, are thinking about the future. Who else is thinking about the future? Everyone. Not as many people as I would hope. Well, what's that? DARPA, Department of Defense. But there's a whole other community out there that does this all the time. And it's speculative and science fiction. So this is just a set of books that are loosely on the topic of different aspects of the Anthropocene. None of these, I think, try and tackle the whole shebang. But in this case, they're looking at different aspects of it, either from a more of a climate perspective, a resource security perspective, a sea level rise perspective, lots of different ways people are thinking about the future. I'm also a huge science and speculative fiction nerd, so if you want to talk about any of this, let me know. I would love to talk about any of these books. These are all actually, I would recommend all of these if you want to looking for a good book. But it sort of depends on what you're interested in. We'll talk about it later. Okay. So stories are very useful for examining the Anthropocene. They allow us to interrogate the edges of possibility, getting at things like the preposterous, especially the preferable. Stories can play with concepts that we would label preposterous and things that we might deem unpreferable, not preferable. And so my first foray into this work was about a decade ago with actually a member of my PhD cohort, working on something totally different, but wanted somebody to sort of brainstorm and think together around scenarios. We wrote a paper on the future of the oceans. This artwork was inspired by that paper. And then also, there was an editorial in Nature about this work, talking about the need for expanding the way we think about kind of scenario science. And so this, in my view, and I've probably, okay, we're going to be all right, I think. In my view, this is what radical futures can do from a research perspective. So I've been involved in this research now since I did that radical ocean futures work for some time. And this is the way that I really see this kind of marching forward, at least my contributions, I should say. And so I'm going to touch on each of these three different elements through an example, so a different project example. You're going to see a bunch of artwork throughout today's lecture, and I think almost all of this artwork was produced by an artist named Fabio Komin. The previous one was a Swedish artist named Simon Stellenhag, but much of this artwork was produced by Fabio Komin, and in a sort of, I don't know what you would want to call it, like hashtag art science collaboration, where we're trying to like work together to imagine and think about these different speculative scenarios of the future. So we're going to start with this project that was on the circumpolar Arctic change. So in this effort, what I wanted to try and do is I wanted to look at scenarios of Arctic change, such as they are, and sort of see whether or not a radical futures approach could give us something different, new, maybe add to the insights that exist already. And how can we creatively blend information about what we think about the Arctic with this sort of more creative futures approach? So I wrote a big NSF project. This is right, I think I submitted this in maybe, I want to say February 2020. So that should tell you about where the story is going. And so put together this big NSF proposal. It wasn't exactly a convergent research proposal, but it was sort of in that flavor. And we had this approach where what I wanted to do is I wanted to take future articles about the future Arctic taken from circumpolar news sources to then perform a computational text analysis on that, and then link that with some story-based futuring. That was sort of the idea, the big idea for the NSF proposal. We didn't get funding. Also, there was a pandemic. And so we scaled everything back by probably 2 orders of magnitude, and I hired this awesome undergrad to then work with me on this project. So what did we do? We harvested news articles from publicly available news sources and performed a computational text analysis. Essentially, this is all pre-ChatGPT also. So essentially writing some Python software to interpret the semantic content of these news articles and cluster it in something like a principal components analysis. So we captured all these news sources. We wanted this to be very, very replicable. So public sources, we used Google to search, and then it's all kind of publicly available software. It's only English language, which might be a problem for the circumpolar Arctic, but there's a bunch of news sources like the New Nutsiak News, which actually has sort of a digest of different translated indigenous news sources. And saying the Moscow Times is English language, Russian news, and then several other more Scandinavian types of sources. Anyway, so we had more than 2,000 news articles that we performed this computational text analysis on, and we got something like this, where the software that we wrote sort of clusters the information. It's something called a latent Dirichlet allocation. And it has anybody done computational text analysis out of curiosity? No, okay. The idea is essentially you're trying to filter through the text that's available and identify which ideas cluster together, occur together. And then you can get a sense of, in this case, let's see if this works. Right there. These ideas are clustering together, which means maybe a lot of these terms co-occur across this corpus, this set of 2,000 documents. And then these might represent more kind of like kind of edge cases, outliers. So what this ends up looking like is it's a set of words. So this is across the entire corpus, the words that appear most commonly. But you can choose a specific cluster. So in this case, we're choosing this 5th cluster right here that's highlighted. These are the words in the red kind of descending bar graph that sort of describe what this cluster of these news articles are really talking about. What are the ideas that they're talking about? And then we actually used the fact that this kind of the PCA provided us with a sense of which which clusters of ideas appear together and which are distant from one another. And then we use that and we labeled these axes, which of course don't have actual labels like this, but we used this information and said, okay, what if we prescribe what these could represent in terms of expected or unexpected climate change and high or low cooperation? I can talk a lot more about why we did it this way. And so what we did is we classified each of these clusters, and then we went through we wanted to have a systematic procedure. Again, how could you take something like this and then come up with a way to then inject this into a creative, imaginative process? So the first one was to define this topic. In this case, it was expected climate change with low cooperation. All right, topic 5. We label it in terms of what are the key words, what are the ideas that come out. So something about industrial development, extraction, finance, agreements. And then we distilled it down to a specific topic, something like an extractive industrial Arctic. And then we went through a very kind of systematic process for each one of these clusters where we use existing futures methods approaches, creative approaches for scenario design to then generate these speculative scenarios. And so the top one is sort of a brainstorming strategy called Futures Wheels. The bottom one is something called the 3 Horizons Framework. If you come to this workshop later this afternoon, we're going to use some of these approaches, or you're going to learn some of these approaches. And then we have several more steps where we try and probe reality and do something called push toward ridiculousness. So in the spirit of what Jim Day taught, his second law, the only useful ideas about the future should at first appear to be ridiculous, we embraced that. And we really wanted to try and say, okay, what are some things that we could do that would be very different in this scenario? But another way to do this is to actually look at the artwork that was produced ultimately for this scenario. So all of this was leading towards a story-based scenario. So sometimes we think about narrative scenarios, which are sort of a thick description of a future world. And this goes further than that, saying, okay, well, let's visit that world, let's inhabit that world, and let's have characters in that world and actually tell a story in that world. And this is a totally different way to engage and think about what it means to be in that world. It allows you to actually explore things that are good or bad, et cetera. So in this case, this extractive industrial Arctic, we wound up with a character called Misha. She was a climate migrant going from southern North America to northern North America, fleeing something. It was sort of vague about what she was fleeing, going to essentially this camp that's run by corporate mining interests. The nation states have kind of dissolved a bit more, and corporate interests have sort of been ascendant. And in this case, she's going to seek the ability to work and find a safe place to live. And so in this case, this story is about rare earth mineral extraction, some futuristic rare earth mineral extraction, but it's as much about her and what her life is like as a climate migrant, the trauma that she experiences through that process. And it takes place, and so the story is all about her, a day in the life, as this climate migrant who's now become part of this mining operation and hoping to sort of serve out her contract such that she can then kind of live in the ideal lifestyle that she's seen in the ads for this particular corporation. So the scenarios, each one of these scenarios is meant to describe and explore a future world based on these ideas that are contained in this corpus, but then also to explore it through the lens of a particular character that might inhabit that world. So we did this over the course for all of the 10 different scenario clusters that we identified. And then I worked with Fabio to create these pieces of artwork. I shouldn't say that. I talked with Fabio, and he created the artwork for each one of these scenarios. But we did it very iteratively. And some of the scenarios are kind of somewhat optimistic, and some of them are very much not optimistic. And just as a note, the polar bear one looks particularly dark. But this is one where they're actually trying to come up with ways to genetically modify polar bears to actually inhabit an ice-free Arctic. In a future where there's no foraging habitat for polar bears, how are they going to survive? And so this is actually, believe it or not, a hopeful story about polar bears surviving into the future. But anyway, so we did this. And you might be like, okay, what the heck? Why would you? This is, you made art, but what's the point? So these story-based futures methods allowed us to combine numerous types of data and ideas. As far as I could tell from the literature, nothing like this had been done before, to take computational text analysis, bring it together with this story-based futuring, and then especially with the artist. It was probably the hardest peer review process that I've ever gone through because it touched on, I don't know, 3 or 4 different pretty distinct disciplines, computational humanities, et cetera. But it was revealing. I learned a lot just through the review process. I'm not just saying that because I'm being recorded. And actually, one of the things that came out is some of the scenarios that were revealed by this effort were represented, reasonably well represented in, say, like the Arctic Resilience Report and so forth, that generate these sort of updates to scenarios that are possible. But there were some other scenarios that came out of this that really were absent from existing literature. So one example of that is, what happens if the world does not follow like a uniform path to, say, decarbonization or not, but it's a much messier world? And what happens when sort of geopolitics come into play? So if, say, Russia were to go on its own and say, you know what, we're not going to decarbonize, we're going to keep, you know, extracting fossil fuels, but everybody else does. How does that work? What happens in that world? So we tried to, it turned out that this was able to sort of highlight possibilities that weren't being talked about so much yet. Okay. The next effort is on the topic of atmospheric water governance. So we'll set the Arctic to the side. Let's see. Yeah, we're doing okay. And so the first one was my first attempt to sort of lead sort of a project to try and bring together different approaches for thinking about the story-based futuring. This next one is actually bringing together a lot of my existing physical science work and then trying to infuse that with sort of a story-based futuring approach. So some of my past work has looked at how atmospheric water moves around the planet, atmospheric water transport, atmospheric water tracking, and straying into, not delving too deeply, but straying into the topic of atmospheric water governance. And so in this crowd, I don't need to probably say any of this, but global land use change and climate change are altering the atmospheric water cycle. So this is a very simple representation of the atmospheric water cycle. Thinking about evaporation being transported over land and then being recycled over land. So this last part, the evaporation that arises over land and returns back to land is what I'm talking about when I talk about terrestrial moisture recycling. And it's this part that humanity can really tinker with in some ways from land use change. So the decisions that people make to deforest a rainforest or to transform a semi-arid grassland into essentially a giant cornfield, that can really lead to substantial changes in moisture transport regionally. And questions of management and governance have been kind of bouncing around in different agencies around the world. So the Food and Agriculture Organization has been interested in this topic for quite a long time. That's a UN agency. Other UN agencies have been interested, but it's also, there have been other groups that have been interested, say, even in the state of Colorado. So my master's student right now is working on a project funded by the Colorado Water Conservation Board, thinking about how moisture recycling may or may not have contributed to some of the extreme precipitation that happened in 2023. So when I talk about this, I'm thinking about the flow of moisture among different places, sources and sinks. That's sort of the language that I use in some of my work. And so I've highlighted a handful of countries in South America here, and we can think about how these countries essentially send moisture or receive moisture from one another. We can do that, and I can explain the model that I use. I don't think I have that slide in here for some reason. Oh yeah, but I have it in tiny text at the bottom. So using ERA interim data, this is ERA interim, we use ERA 5 now, in a water tracking model called the Water Accounting Model 2 Layers. This was developed by Ruud van der Ent, a Dutch researcher 15 years ago now, that's crazy. And it's essentially an integrated water transport model. And we can use that to track the sources and sinks of moisture globally. And so one way we can represent that is with this chord diagram. So the way to interpret this is if it's the same color, it means precipitation is falling in that country or that sink. And if it's a different color, such that, say, we're looking at, I won't touch the screen, don't worry. We're looking at moisture that's evaporating, say, from the ocean and being transported elsewhere. So we can look at the example of Bolivia, and we can see that it gets a substantial amount of its precipitation from oceanic evaporation. But we can also see that it receives substantial evaporation from somewhere else. And in this case, we can see around a quarter of its rain comes from Brazil. This is probably not a surprise, thinking about the Amazon and how the prevailing wind patterns transport moisture in South America. But we can see that Brazil is actually functioning a little bit like a water tower for many countries. So Uruguay, Paraguay, Bolivia, and Argentina all are receiving substantial fractions of their domestic precipitation from Brazilian evapotranspiration. And this sort of result, in my kind of experience in this field, has led to a lot of interest on the part of some of these international agencies, international organizations, both kind of governmental, or I'm not sure, is the UN governmental, non-governmental, and then NGO as well. And so in some work that I've done in the past, we tried to start exploring what are the law and governance mechanisms that could exist specifically to be brought to bear for moisture recycling questions, but in similar ways could also be analogous to thinking about questions related to, say, precipitation enhancement, cloud seeding, and so forth. Whether or not it's actually happening, the perception, whether or not it's effective, I should say, the perception of effectiveness. What kinds of mechanisms might need to be brought to bear? So this is sort of descending order from kind of legally binding mechanisms, things like proof of harm, which has international environmental legal precedent, specifically in the case of the United States and Canada, I think is like the seminal paper, the seminal event, all the way down to things that are non-binding, very flexible, things like multinational scientific assessment. There's an ongoing, I mean, I don't know for how much longer, but an ongoing USGS-sponsored climate change and biodiversity assessment happening right now among Canada, the United States, and Mexico, which is non-binding, but it's a congressionally mandated document to try and talk about those topics. So that would be an example of a multinational scientific assessment. So what about economics, or what are some other approaches that could be brought to bear here? So those are more law and governance mechanisms, but I've sort of been interested in this topic from the perspective of, say, resource management. And so one way that we can think about this is we can think about atmospheric water as a public good. So if you're familiar with like common pool resources, maybe you've come across some of those ideas, we can think about non-excludable and excludable. That means you can prohibit the access to something by controlling access to that. I sometimes think of movie theater tickets like this. There's somebody like taking tickets at the front, they can exclude access to a resource, the movie. Non-rival or rival means that you can either you can use something up or that it is essentially bottomless. And when you combine those two things together, you can get this quadrant space of different resources. So typically, or not even typically, just by default, atmospheric water is considered something that you can't use up and that you can't exclude others from having. All right, this is sort of the default setting. But in fact, it might not be totally true. So in some cases, there's strong evidence to say that, yeah, if you actually change the land surface in one place, you can actually reduce the amount of moisture downwind. You can actually change the amount. You can't necessarily use it up, but you can certainly affect the amount of moisture that might go somewhere else. So in this case, moisture recycling might actually move down into this kind of common pool resource domain. And in other cases, very substantial land use changes, say in the Indian subcontinent, have led to potentially changes in the atmospheric wind patterns in that particular part of the world. And so while it's not on purpose, there is potentially this effect of substantial land use change changing wind patterns, which means that different sets of actors now might be getting moisture that they might not otherwise have received. And so those two things are pretty well supported in the literature as possibilities, this one especially down here in the lower left. And the private good domain requires somebody that water could be excluded, people could be excluded from receiving it, and that it would decrease the amount, both at the same time, which in my mind is sort of the domain of cloud seeding, which I was sort of like, well, you know, jury is mostly out there. But there was a couple papers that came out a few years ago, led by, I think, a lot of authors at RAL, that provided, to me at least, a really kind of interesting technical demonstration, albeit very small. This was the Snowy project of detectable effectiveness of cloud seeding. Now, albeit very small amounts, I was kind of shocked when I read the paper because it was the first time I'd come across something that actually was saying that, yeah, this probably worked. So I've put that, I think this is the University of Wyoming plane that they use for cloud seeding experiments. I put that down there saying that if all of these were possible, what does that tell us about the prospects of moisture recycling governance, atmospheric water governance? How would we need to be thinking about this question differently if all of these were true? And I suspect that we would have to be thinking about it very differently for different situations. So to actually answer this question, I got all these different types of water experts from around the world together. This was still during the pandemic, so it's a virtual workshop. And what I did is, so there are people looking at global water security, food and water, much more from the legal perspective, et cetera, a whole range of different people. And I ran a futures workshop with them, not pretty similar to what's going to happen this afternoon, where I wanted them to think about these ideas. What could the future of atmospheric water governance look like if we used this sort of framing as a springboard? And so they were each assigned, I think in teams of 2, they had to think through, they had to be in one of these different quadrants of that, one of these quadrants. Think together. I ran them through this kind of speculative radical futures workshop. And then at the end of that, I need you to read this entire wall of text. So I'm going to pause for the next 25 minutes so you can read this all. This is just to say that they came up with 10 very unique different scenarios exploring different quadrants of that space of how atmospheric water could function depending on its excludability and its rivalry, that quadrant space and then each of them, a very brief snippet, a description of the world and the story that exists. But to do more effective ways, I'm just going to show you one of the scenarios that came out of this effort. And this is called T-trading, which is short for transpiration trading. So this is a world where weather modification has been banned, but transpiration is managed to maximize downwind moisture, leading to surprising outcomes of forest conservation. Because in this world, this future, and again, you're like, what are you talking about? This sounds made up. It's all made up. This is speculative, right? Like this is the creative output of this workshop exercise. But what we wanted to understand is what are some of the ways that this could unfold, surprising ways. And in this case, because weather modification was banned, society found other ways to sort of get their kind of desired moisture or atmospheric water outcomes. The story is actually about an employee of this future thing, a transpiration futures trading company called Sky Connect LLC. And it's as much about her job as it is about sort of her role and her life in this future world. So the character is visiting the holdings of this company, which is in the Tiputini region of the Amazon. And so she's exploring what the facility looks like, how it's managing for maximum transpiration. She's also visiting the lab where they're developing new different types of species of plants. And then ultimately, though, it's a story about her kind of revisiting where she grew up. So this is her actually, she grew up in this part of the Amazon region. And so it's a story both about her role in the company, but about her as a person. You might be like, what's the point? Like, why are you writing about people? And the whole point of these sorts of scenario approaches is not just to describe a possible future. It's to get you to forget that you're reading a scenario. It's to get people to inhabit the world as they're writing it, to sort of have a different sense of connection to what this future is and could mean. And that process, I'm going to say at the very end, has led to some surprising things in my own work. So again, I worked with Fabio, who worked with, in this case, the whole team to come up with these amazing illustrations, these kind of visuals that represent the different scenarios that were generated. And I could talk at length about every one of these, but one of the things that I want to highlight, though, is that out of this sort of exercise, you might be like, what's the point? What can you get? Well, one of the things you can get is it can actually raise a whole host of different types of research questions that might launch, I don't want to say an NSF project. It might launch a whole other research trajectory that you didn't even realize is worth exploring. So for a pretty plausible type of future, kind of that's narrower in the futures cone, what types of financial instruments could drive changes in atmospheric water flow? Okay, so that's, what if there was such a thing as transpiration futures trading? Well, that might lead to some pretty weird outcomes in terms of conservation. Well, let's think about the possible. So let's widen the futures cone a little bit. How might international treaties about atmospheric policy broadly impact the atmospheric water cycle? That might not even be that weird, because that's actually happening now, right? We have international treaties around different atmospheric phenomena, and they were definitely going to have consequences for the atmospheric water cycle. Let's go in the preferable domain. What is necessary to demonstrate proof of harm arising from land use change in another country? What one country would actually prefer to be the case might be different than what the country across the border actually wants to have happen. And so that preferability matters for the types of things that could be simulated. And then lastly, in terms of what are the kind of stranger questions that this scenario specifically raised, is could atmospheric water be tagged in real time to denote its country of origin, such that then you could attribute change in one place to a decision that somebody made upwind? As far as I know, we can't do that right now. But if that were possible, that would change the stakes of what some of these decisions might actually imply in terms of responsibility, culpability, maybe even profitability. And actually, we totally don't have time for this last section. So if you want to talk about this, we're going to have to talk about it another time. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to zoom to the end. Okay, this is not what you're supposed to do in a talk. I'm going to zoom to the end because I want to have enough time for some questions. Oh yeah, I alluded to this. One of the things that has been really, so I use this method in pretty much all the classes that I teach at CSU. So I teach a class in undergrad, sort of capstone synthesis class on sea level rise, and I teach a class on climate change scenarios to graduate students. And I use this approach at the end of the classes for them to sort of synthesize across all the different kinds of content that they've learned throughout the course. So they take their quantitative insights, their geospatial insights, the policy implications, et cetera. They combine all that, and I run a workshop for each of those classes where they go through this and learn how to do this sort of radical futuring. Not just it's fun, but it's also a way to sort of synthesize across content that has very little resonance in some cases, but in other ways can have a lot of resonance. So this is actually, but as a result of that, before we go to that, as a result of that, I've learned through, I guess, the course of teaching this for the last 7 or 8 years, is that it leads to this surprising sense of agency in and with the future. People that maybe on paper, they think about the future, they don't often visit it. They don't often inhabit. They don't think about what is my life going to be like in 45 years, in 50 years, in 100 years. And so this process of actually doing this sort of engagement, thinking about the future and actually coming up with a scenario themselves that's creative, actually allows them to a totally different connection to the future. And so this was true, I mentioned this USGS assessment. I ran a workshop last year at our lead author meeting at Asilomar in California. And I use this in my sea level rise class where the students come up with scenarios of the future that could, in a specific place, that could unfold under existing projections of sea level rise. And this is, I ask them on the final assessment for that project, they have to say, how did this affect their thinking about the future? And they're allowed to just say it did not affect my thinking of the future, and they just have to say that for 250 words. They just copy and paste. They can do that. Nobody's done it yet, but they're allowed to do that. But a lot of them have said this actually, like they'll say something like, I've been super pessimistic about the future, and this actually helped me to think a little bit more broadly than I have been. And surprisingly, that comment will often come from people who write the most pessimistic scenario of the future with sea level rise, and yet they have this sort of like optimistic take still. And so this has been a really, I'm not an expert on like agency, but I think there's something here. I think there's something here about how this can engage people's minds. And anyway, I've guest lectured on this stuff in a bunch of classes at CSU. But the coolest thing that I want to say is this grad student class that I teach on climate change scenarios, they were all tasked with saying, okay, we did it. We achieved net zero decarbonization, and they had to write a scenario about that future. What does that actually look like? It didn't have to be a desirable future, but it had to be a net zero future. And so they all went through this process, and so we've got like 12 scenarios at this point across the 2 classes of like a fully decarbonized future, kind of a speculative fiction story. And those grad student stories are now being incorporated by art students at CSU to create fully illustrated kind of capstone projects of those scenarios. So it's this cool collaboration between grad students and these art students co-designing these decarbonization futures. I just think that's a really cool thing that's happening. I don't have anything to show you yet because the projects aren't done. Okay, so I think that radical futures methods can help society to really orient, anticipate, and navigate the future turbulence, all the stuff that we don't know that's barreling towards us, that this allows us to really widen the aperture. And at the end of the day, we're not trying to get the future right. We're trying to really understand how to orient in the present day. And Kim Stanley Robinson, another great author, has this quote. So we'll leave this quote here. You can never properly predict the future as it really turns out. You're doing something a little different when you write science fiction. You're trying to take a different perspective on now. So with that, sum up, and I'll take questions. Thank you.
questions, or if you're online, use Slido. Super weird talk, maybe digress. Yeah, great. Go ahead.
Oh, sorry, you're in charge. You're in charge.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say this was incredible, mind blowing. But how can we take these ideas and put them into like the CMIP scenario MIP sort of framing and think about how we're exploring using our Earth system models to try and understand the future?
Yeah, I think there's a lot you could do there. I mean, it'd be really interesting to like get at one of these CMIP meetings to have a workshop like this. I think what would happen is probably people would realize that they're doing really well trying to tackle certain aspects of kind of future possibilities, and that it might reveal whole domains that aren't even really being considered, maybe can't be considered with current configurations of the models, but that just even being aware that these are topics that might reasonably need to be tackled, it could shift kind of maybe what's being included. I think another thing that could be revealed is the academic disciplines that are represented in some of these processes to define like what are the questions, what are the like key areas of innovation we need to target, say for CMIP 7, CMIP 8. And it could be a very different set depending on the outcomes of such a scenario exercise. Because there are things that we're at this point really like fine tuning, and there are other things that are just completely open questions, especially things related to how society reacts to certain kinds of changes and so forth. So that could be, I don't know, there could be a lot of opportunity there. I think it could be, at this point, my gut tells me it would be best served as almost something to instigate questions. And those questions, it's hard to predict where that could lead. So I don't know if that helps.
Oh yeah, totally.
Jesse, did you?
Oh, well, I mean, I thought this was a great talk. It made me think speculatively, I guess. So, I mean, you know, one of your like future laws or something, or
Not mine, those Jim Day terms.
Okay, well, but, you know, I mean, they talk about how like we always overestimate social change and underestimate technological change. But I mean, that clearly seems to be how much of that is based on the fact that was done in kind of like the 20th century, where like we had a lot of rapid technological change.
True.
Whereas like you could imagine like the 1500s, from 15 to 1700, they may not, you know, muskets I guess were musketier, but you know, otherwise it was the same. but there was a lot of social change, right? Like the Enlightenment.
Yeah.
So I mean.
That's a great example.
Oh, okay. Well, thanks. But I mean, like, I'm just basing it like your art. Like your art's just a lot of advanced technology. So how confident can we be that technology will be significantly more advanced in the future versus?
Yeah, I mean, it's a fair question, and it's a great example to look further back because, yeah, technology was, and society in some cases, I mean, the Enlightenment was a big one, but, you know, if we look back a lot further, like, kind of things were pretty similar for many thousands of years, in some ways, depending on who you were and your sort of position in society, right? If you were a serf, there have been serfs for a long time. And so it's fair to say that in recent times, like industrialization, the modern era, it's been a very different pace of change. Different aspects of our society have changed. And that change has touched more people, perhaps, than it did historically. I think it's an open question. So there's other thinkers that have done a much bigger, deeper dive in this sort of thing. So the author Václav Smil has thought a lot about historically how change unfolds. And he's written a little bit about the future. I think he's a little bit he's a little bit of a skeptic when it comes to like how much change will continue to unfold, whether or not it's going to continue increasing in terms of accelerating rates of change or accelerating change for technology, for example. Yeah, you're right. And one of the purposes of this is to sort of say, if we took that as let's take that as a starting point, technology change stops, progress stops, or it stops accelerating, it goes to linear instead of being nonlinear progress, or change rather. What are the implications of that? I mean, that's a perfect starting point for a sci-fi prototyping exercise, one of theoretical futuring exercises.
At 1 p.m.
That's not the guardrail for the 1 p.m.
It's not the guardrail, yeah.
But you could explore that. But it's a really important question. Yeah, we sort of take that for granted in some cases that things will continue to change. Just because they are now doesn't mean that they will continue sort of in perpetuity. Because at some point then, you know, like we're all just part of some artificial superintelligence or something. I don't know what the end game is there. So I think that going to your point though, asking that question of like, what assumptions are we making when we're engaging in this sort of futuring process, that's one of the most important points. And surfacing those assumptions.
Cool, thank you. Yeah.
If you take one of your tools, like the textual analysis tool that you applied to the Arctic Circumpolar story, a project, take those tools and apply them to early 20th century
Yeah,
and see what stories you end up with for
totally.
the second half of the, does that end up, your punchline at the end was, we're not doing prediction, but would that tell you something about the abilities or pros and cons or disadvantages or tell you about those tools? Could you learn more about the effectiveness or strengths and weaknesses of those tools?
I think what it would probably reveal is, just like in the present, it reveals the anxieties of the present, right? It reveals the preoccupations of the present. So like, the analysis that we did was trying to work towards scenarios of the future, representing possibilities in the future. But at the end of the day, it just reflects, or it's the starting point was the preoccupations of present day news articles about the future Arctic. And in the same way, if we did the same thing with, say, 1930s journalism about the future of the Union in the United States or something, then we would come up with a whole bunch of scenarios that just reflect the kind of, preoccupations, prejudices, biases of that future. I don't think it would necessarily say, and that's why I ended with that quote from Kim Stanley Robinson. Lots of different authors have said something almost identical to that, where a lot of these efforts are really, we're gonna be so wildly wrong no matter what with a lot of the speculation. But what it does is it allows us to see the present with a lot more clarity about where might we actually be headed? Where could we be headed from here? And it turns out maybe we're headed to in a lot more directions than we think right now. So I don't know. I think that it's hard to use it as almost like a cool. It's hard. I don't know how you would do that necessarily. And that's actually getting in this domain of like digital humanities, where there is a lot of work where this sort of approach is computational analysis, text analysis, has been deployed to understand what people thought, how they thought at different times during using different like written corpuses. I don't know, probably not answering your question adequately. Okay.
It is 12.
Oh, okay.
So I will take an online question just to be fair, but if you need to leave, you can go. Thanks for a great talk and very interesting work. I was intrigued by words that came up in your Arctic Futures statistics and surprised that several of the words I guessed weren't there. I think that voices of indigenous Arctic communities are often not reflected in published literature.
Yeah, and there was some of that was actually a distinct cluster. So there was a whole cluster that was really baked around indigenous Arctic identity, but it was biased in part towards, I think, North American indigenous identity, especially Alaskan. And so I take that point well, and actually, backstory is the whole NSF project that was not funded was around partnering with a circumpolar local libraries, many of which were located in indigenous communities. So that's the long-term goal, is I really wanted it to be focused on indigenous Arctic communities. It just didn't pan out. Also, there was a pandemic. But I take that point, that's still one of our major goals with that effort.
Sounds like including oral history libraries and...
Yeah, and that's something we thought about with oral history libraries and trying to think about what were some other ways to do this, to include indigenous communities. Yeah, the Project Jukebox is such a cool project. I haven't done that yet. Email me, let's talk about it. But that's another thing that I think there's some really cool opportunities there, especially with those oral records. So.
All right, we are doing lunch, so if you have more questions and you want to chat with Pat, we can meet there. All right, thank
Oh, yeah.
Right up there.
She's writing a thesis right now. She's listening online. Yeah. 20 questions.